I heard my ex-husband's voice through the hospital curtain before I could even lift my hand to push it open. "She's not going to be running anything for a while," he said. Low, certain, like he'd already made up his mind about what came next. "We should talk about the business accounts." The morphine made everything slow except my hearing. "My name is Lena Hartwell. I'm 32 years old. I own, or I owned, depending on who you ask, a boutique financial consulting firm outside of Columbus, Ohio. 12 clients, 7 figures in annual contracts, and a decade of 18-hour days poured into every wall of that office. And the man in the hallway, the one talking about my accounts like I was already a footnote, was my ex-husband of 14 months. We'd been divorced for a year and 2 months when a driver ran a red light at Morse Road in Sinclair. Broken collarbone, fractured pelvis, severe concussion. I was unconscious for 4 days. When I came back, I was told he had listed himself as my emergency contact, something he'd never bothered to remove after the divorce, and something I hadn't thought to change either. In those 4 days, he had convinced the hospital he was acting in my best interest. That was the door he needed. What he didn't know, what no one knew except the contractor who'd installed it and who had moved to Portland 2 years ago, was about the floor panel in the storage room at the back of my office. Beneath a commercial-grade utility shelf, behind a false base panel, was a fireproof lockbox bolted to the concrete slab. I had put it there in my second year of business, not because I was paranoid. Because I grew up watching my mother lose everything in a divorce with no documentation, no copies, no proof of anything she'd contributed to a 20-year marriage. I swore I would never be that woman. I didn't plan for my ex-husband specifically. I planned for the world being the way it is. By the time I was coherent enough to hold my phone, the damage was already visible. My office manager, a woman named Tessa who'd worked with me for 3 years, had sent 6 messages in 48 hours. She couldn't reach me. She couldn't reach legal. My ex had shown up twice, once with a man she didn't recognize and had asked to see the client contract files. She'd told him no both times, but the second time he'd mentioned something about shared business interest, and she'd felt uneasy enough to call a locksmith to change the back office lock on her own initiative and pay for it out of petty cash. Tessa probably saved my company. I didn't cry reading those messages. I've thought about that since. Why I didn't cry. I think the concussion had something to do with it, but I also think some part of me had known for a long time that my ex-husband never fully accepted that I had built something he hadn't helped build something he hadn't helped build. During our marriage, he'd always called it our firm, even though my name was the only one on the LLC, even though I'd started it 2 years before we met. He said it warmly, like it was affection. I see now it was a statement of intent. The concussion had scrambled my short-term memory but left my long-term thinking sharp in a strange way, like everything extraneous had been burned off, and what remained was just clarity. I knew what I needed to do. I just needed to do it carefully. I asked my nurse for a notepad. The first thing I wrote down was the name of my attorney, James Okafor. He'd handled my divorce and he knew my ex-husband's patterns. I asked Tessa to contact him quietly, not through my office email, through her personal account. I told her what to say, that there may have been an unauthorized attempt to access business records while I was incapacitated, and that James should preserve everything. The second thing I wrote was a short list, 3 items. Only I knew what they meant. I didn't ask anyone to visit the storage room. Not yet. The third thing I did was what cost me the most emotionally, even though it looked like nothing from the outside. I called my ex-husband. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been waiting. Lena. His voice shifted into something warm and practiced. "God, I've been so worried. How are you feeling?" "Still pretty out of it," I said. I kept my voice soft, a little blurry. "The doctors say I need to rest for a few more weeks." Of course you do. Don't even think about work right now." "I won't," I said. "Thanks for being there. I heard you've been really helpful." He paused just half a second too long. "I just wanted to make sure everything was taken care of." "I know," I said. "That means a lot." I hung up and lay there staring at the ceiling tiles and felt something settle in my chest, cold and very, very calm. He thought I was still foggy. He thought I was grateful. He thought he had more time. He didn't. Here's what he had done as James pieced it together over the following week. He had used his status as emergency contact to get a letter from the hospital confirming I was incapacitated. He'd taken that letter to my bank, a regional bank where my business account had been held for 6 years, and attempted to have himself added as a temporary signatory under a medical necessity clause. The bank had stalled him, thank God, because my business account had a dual authorization requirement that my accountant and I had set up specifically after the divorce. He hadn't been able to touch the money, but he had accessed my business address with a key I hadn't known he'd kept from when we were together, and he'd gone through my filing cabinet. Some physical client folders were disturbed. Nothing was taken as far as we could tell, but the intent was obvious. He was looking for leverage, for something he could use to claim involvement in the business, for anything that had his name adjacent to mine on paper. He didn't find what he was looking for in those folders. What he wanted was in the floor. I was discharged 3 weeks after admission. My collarbone was in a sling. I had a cane for the pelvis, and my head still ached behind my left eye every afternoon like clockwork. My sister drove me home, fussing the whole way about whether I should stay with her instead. I told her I needed to go to the office first. She thought I meant to check in. I didn't correct her. I had Tessa clear the storage room of anything movable before I arrived. When my sister helped me through the front door, I told her I needed 5 minutes alone to process being back. She teared up and waited in the lobby. I moved slower than I wanted to. My body wasn't cooperating. But I made it to the storage room, got down on one knee with my good side, pressed the release on the false space panel, and heard the click. The lockbox was exactly where I'd left it. Inside, 2 USB drives with encrypted backups of every client contract, every financial statement, every internal email from the last 4 years. A notarized copy of my LLC formation documents dated 2017, 2 years before I met my ex-husband. A copy of the divorce decree with the explicit clause that neither party retained any claim to the other's business holdings. A sealed envelope I'd prepared after the divorce was finalized, labeled in my own handwriting, in case he tries. I had written it as a joke to myself, honestly. The kind of dark humor you develop after a bad marriage. I hadn't actually expected to open it. Inside was a 2-page document I'd asked James to draft 18 months ago. A preemptive affidavit, notarized and witnessed, stating that my ex-husband had no legal, financial, or operational stake in my business at any point during or after our marriage, and that any claim to the contrary should be considered fraudulent. I'd also attached 4 years of tax returns filed under my name alone, proof of my business loan repayment from before we met, and a timeline of client acquisition that made it visually, irrefutably clear that the business predated him entirely. I sat on the floor of that storage room with my sling and my cane, and I let myself breathe for a minute. Then I put everything in a tote bag and asked my sister to take me home. James filed the injunction 2 days later. It froze my ex-husband's ability to represent himself as having any interest in my business, and formally notified the bank to disregard any prior requests made under the medical incapacity letter. We also filed a complaint with the Ohio State Bar because the man he'd brought to my office, the one Tessa didn't recognize, turned out to be a notary. My ex had been trying to get documents notarized, documents that, as far as anyone could tell, he drafted himself. That's when it stopped being a civil matter and started being something else. The detective assigned to the case was a woman in her 50s who wore reading glasses on a chain and asked questions in a way that sounded casual until you realized she'd already caught you in 3 contradictions. She called me on a Tuesday, said she'd been reviewing the timeline and had a few things she wanted to clarify. She was thorough and quiet, and when she said his name, she said it without any particular feeling, which I appreciated. My ex was interviewed twice. The second interview, James told me later, lasted 4 hours. I was not in those rooms. I was at physical therapy, learning to walk without the cane. But I was told that the documents he'd prepared, the ones the notary had been brought in to certify, contained a signature block for me. He'd planned to sign on my behalf, under the medical incapacity letter, as if my unconscious body had agreed to make him a partner in something I had spent a decade building without him. The criminal fraud charge was filed 6 weeks after my discharge. Here's the part I didn't expect. The part I'd put in a sealed envelope and half forgotten. My divorce attorney, not James, my original divorce attorney, had included a clause at my insistence in our final settlement agreement. I'd fought for it, actually. My ex hadn't wanted it. He said it was insulting. The clause stated that if either party was found to have made any fraudulent misrepresentation or unauthorized legal action relating to the other's business assets after the divorce was finalized, the offending party would forfeit their right to the ongoing spousal support payment that had been part of our settlement. He had been receiving $800 a month from me since the divorce. Because he had worked part-time for 2 years while I built the business, and because Ohio considers marital contribution in ways that don't always feel fair, a judge had awarded him that payment for 3 years. I had 18 months left to pay. When the fraud charge was filed, my attorney filed the motion to terminate those payments immediately. The judge granted it in 9 days. I stood in the parking lot outside the courthouse on a Thursday morning, collarbone still sore, wearing a blouse with one sleeve cut open to fit over the sling, and I thought about the storage room floor, about the contractor who'd built it, a quiet man named Alejandro who'd done 3 other jobs for me and who I'd paid in cash and tipped well, and who had once told me, without context, that he'd seen too many people leave their important things where anyone could find them. I hadn't known what he meant then. I understood it now. There's something people don't tell you about being in a hospital bed while someone is dismantling your life. They tell you to focus on healing. They tell you people are complicated and grief makes them act in ways they wouldn't otherwise. They tell you to be careful about burning bridges. What they don't tell you is that the clarity you gain in those first hours of coming back to yourself, that specific quality of awareness that comes when you understand what someone was willing to do while you couldn't stop them, is actually a form of knowledge you don't lose. It stays with you. It reorganizes things. I don't think about my ex-husband the way I used to, which was with a kind of exhausted residual fondness, the way you feel about a place you lived and were unhappy in but still sometimes miss because of the light in the morning. I don't feel that anymore. What I feel is closer to professional dispassion. He made a calculation and it was wrong, and the consequences of a wrong calculation aren't personal, they're just outcomes. My business is still mine. My name is still on the door. Tessa got a raise, and the title change she'd been asking about for 2 years. James and I had lunch last month, and he ordered the wrong thing and complained about it for 40 minutes, and it was the most normal 2 hours I'd had since the accident. The lockbox is still in the floor. I checked last week. I didn't put it there because I was afraid. I put it there because I understood, even before I had a reason to understand it, that the things worth protecting are worth protecting before anyone comes for them. They came for mine while I was unconscious and unable to speak, but I had already spoken, just quietly, in a storage room no one knew existed, and when I needed that voice, it was exactly where I'd left it. The thing I keep coming back to is the floor panel. Not the court date, not the fraud charge, not even the moment the spousal support was terminated. The floor panel. The fact that I knelt down in a storage room with a broken collarbone and a cane and pressed a latch I'd installed years before I had any reason to need it. I've thought a lot about what that means. Not in the dramatic way, just quietly, the way you turn something over when you're driving alone or waiting for coffee to brew. I think it means that integrity isn't only about how you treat people when things are going well. It's about whether you can look at your own life clearly enough to prepare for the version of the future that isn't guaranteed. I didn't know my ex-husband would one day walk into my office with a notary while I was unconscious. I just knew that the world is uncertain and that the things I'd worked for deserved to be protected before anyone came for them. There's something honest in that, something that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with taking your own life seriously. What he did required a particular kind of thinking, the kind that looks at someone else's decade of work and sees an opportunity rather than a person. I don't think he woke up one morning and decided to become that. I think it accumulated slowly. Every time he called my firm hours, every time he watched me close a deal and recalculated what he thought he was owed. Entitlement doesn't announce itself. It just quietly rewrites the story until the person who built something becomes an obstacle in their own narrative. But here's what I know about that kind of thinking. It's lazy. It counts on the other person being unprepared, being too hurt or too sick or too trusting to fight back effectively. It doesn't account for someone who has already done the hard, unglamorous work of thinking 3 steps ahead. Tessa changing that lock with petty cash. James preserving the records before anyone asked him to. The encrypted drive sitting in a fireproof box beneath a concrete slab. None of those things happened by accident. They happened because at some point each of us had decided that being careful wasn't the same as being paranoid, it was just being responsible. I think about Alejandro sometimes. The contractor who built the panel, and who told me, without any context, that he'd seen too many people leave their important things where anyone could find them. He didn't know he was giving me advice. I didn't know I was giving me advice. I didn't know I was taking it. But that's how the right information works. It lands quietly and you don't realize how much you needed it until years later in a hospital bed, making a list on a notepad while your collarbone heals. The last thing I'll say is this: I'm not special. I'm not particularly brave. I was scared and in pain and furious in ways I still don't have clean words for. What I had was a set of decisions I'd made in advance when the stakes were low and my thinking was clear. Those decisions held when I couldn't. That's not luck. That's just the quiet, undramatic power of doing the right work before you need it. Protecting what matters, thinking carefully when it's easy, and refusing to fold when someone bets you won't have the strength to stand up. The lockbox is still in the floor. I checked last week. I hope I never need it again. But I'm glad I know exactly where it is.